The spring of 1845 descended upon London with unseasonable warmth, but inside the crystal chandeliers of Thornbridge House, the air felt cold enough to freeze champagne. Lady Elara Davenport stood beside a towering arrangement of white roses, her emerald silk gown catching the candlelight in a way that should have drawn every eye in the ballroom. Her auburn hair was swept into an elegant twist adorned with pearls, and her gray-green eyes tracked one man through the glittering crowd with an intensity that bordered on madness. Smash that subscribe button like it's a crime scene. You don't want to miss what's coming next. 2 years. 2 excruciating, soul-destroying years of careful proximity, of engineered encounters, of what she had foolishly believed were meaningful exchanges, all utterly wasted on the most emotionally impenetrable man in England. Julian Beaumont, Duke of Ashworth, stood near the orchestra platform, his commanding frame making every other gentleman in the room look diminished. His dark hair gleamed in the candlelight, his cravat was tied with that infuriating precision he applied to everything, and those storm-gray eyes were currently focused on Lady Isabella Hartwell, who was laughing at whatever empty charm he was undoubtedly dispensing like worthless coin. "He's worse than insufferable," Elara muttered to her dearest friend, Lady Viola Ashton, who had appeared at her side with 2 glasses of champagne and an expression of profound sympathy. "The Duke?" Viola asked, though her violet eyes sparkled with knowing concern. "What has he done this time?" "Absolutely nothing, which is precisely the catastrophe." Elara seized the champagne and took a gulp that would have scandalized her mother. "Look at him, Viola. Entertaining Isabella Hartwell as though she invented sunlight, when just last week at the Pemberton Musicale, he was complimenting Miss Whitmore's performance with such enthusiasm I thought he'd commission a statue. To be fair, her harp playing was extraordinary." "That's not the point." Elara's voice rose before she caught herself, dropping to a fierce whisper. "The point is that Julian Beaumont bestows his attention on every woman in London except—" She stopped abruptly. "Except you," Viola finished gently. Elara's jaw tightened. It wasn't entirely accurate. The Duke did speak with her, but with the same distant courtesy he'd use with an elderly aunt. There was no heat to it, no genuine interest, no acknowledgement of the electric current that she felt every time they were in the same room. She was simply another obligation on his extensive list of social niceties. "I have made my feelings embarrassingly transparent," Elara said, frustration bleeding through her usual composure. "Last month at the Devonshire garden party, I practically engineered an entire conversation about estate management just to capture his attention for more than 3 minutes. At the Hartley ball, I wore blue because his sister mentioned once it was his favorite color. I have smiled. I have laughed at his mediocre observations. I have done everything short of tattooing your intentions across your forehead," Viola interrupted, not unkindly. "Darling Elara, perhaps it's time to accept that the Duke of Ashworth simply doesn't possess the capacity for deep attachment. He's 30 years old and shows no sign of genuine interest in anyone. He must marry eventually, if only to secure his line." "Yes, but eventually could be a decade from now, and you cannot spend the next 10 years waiting for a man who looks at you as though you're a particularly pleasant piece of furniture." Elara knew Viola was right, which only intensified the sting. She watched as Julian threw his head back in laughter at something Lady Hartwell said, his entire face transforming with an ease he never showed in Elara's presence. Her chest constricted with that familiar, agonizing pressure. She was pathetic. Worse than pathetic. "What I need," Elara said slowly, an idea crystallizing with dangerous clarity, "is to force him to actually see me." Viola's eyes widened in alarm. "Oh no. I recognize that expression. What are you planning?" Before Elara could answer, a smooth, cultured voice interrupted them. "Lady Elara, Lady Viola, how radiant you both look this evening." Lord Alastair Finch, heir to the Marquis of Westford, swept into an elegant bow. With his golden hair, striking blue eyes, and impeccable tailoring, Alistair was considered one of the season's most eligible bachelors. His wealth was legendary, his connections unimpeachable, and his manner so perfectly calibrated it felt almost mechanical. Still, he was invited everywhere, sought after by ambitious mothers, and possessed the exact combination of status and visibility that Elara suddenly needed. "Lord Finch," Elara said, extending her hand with sudden purpose. An idea struck her with such force she nearly gasped aloud. "What a pleasure!" Viola shot her a warning glance, but Elara deliberately ignored it. "I was wondering," Alistair continued, his practiced smile never wavering, "if you might honor me with the next waltz, Lady Elara." This was it. Her opportunity. Her weapon. Elara glanced across the ballroom to where Julian stood, still entertaining Lady Hartwell with that maddening, careless ease. He hadn't looked in her direction even once this entire evening. If he wouldn't notice her alone, perhaps he would notice her in another man's arms. Specifically, in the arms of the one man in London whose eligibility rivaled his own. "I would be delighted," Elara said, placing her gloved hand on Alistair's offered arm with deliberate visibility. As they moved toward the dance floor, she caught Viola's expression, half horrified, half fascinated. Her friend knew her far too well. The waltz was intimate, requiring Alistair's hand at her waist, their bodies moving in synchronized rhythm. During a turn, Elara's eyes found Julian across the crowded ballroom. For one breathless heartbeat, she caught him watching her, his expression unreadable, something dark flickering in those storm-gray eyes. But then Lady Hartwell reclaimed his attention, and the moment shattered like dropped crystal. "You dance exquisitely, Lady Elara," Alistair said as they swept through another turn. "You're too kind, Lord Finch." "Not nearly kind enough, surely. I wonder, my family is hosting an intimate dinner party this Friday evening at Finch Manor. Would you permit me the honor of escorting you?" Elara's heart hammered. A dinner party. A public appearance as Alistair's companion. Precisely the sort of thing that would be noticed and discussed by everyone in society, including a certain emotionally bankrupt Duke. "I should be honored," she heard herself say, though her voice sounded strange to her own ears. "Naturally, I'll bring my chaperone, Mrs. Pemberton." "Of course. Shall I call for you at 7 o'clock? "Perfect." As the waltz concluded and Alistair escorted her back to Viola, Elara felt a strange cocktail of triumph and terror coursing through her veins. She had set her plan in motion. Now she could only pray it would produce the desired effect. "Have you lost your mind?" Viola hissed the instant Alistair departed. "Alistair Finch? Everyone knows he's looking for a wife with the same enthusiasm most men reserve for selecting wallpaper." "Precisely," Elara said, watching as Julian's gaze finally swept in her direction. Their eyes locked across the crowded ballroom, and she lifted her chin with deliberate challenge, offering him the same distant, polite smile he'd given her for 2 agonizing years, before deliberately turning away. "Sometimes, Viola, one must fight ice with fire." "I think you mean fire with fire." "That too." What Elara didn't see as she turned away was the way Julian Beaumont's entire demeanor shifted. The easy charm evaporated like morning fog, replaced by something harder, darker, infinitely more dangerous. He excused himself from Lady Hartwell with such abruptness that the poor woman stood frozen in confusion, and his storm-gray eyes tracked Elara's auburn hair through the crowd with a predatory intensity that would have stolen her breath. He had noticed. Oh yes. The Duke of Ashworth had most definitely noticed. Join the crew. Hit subscribe and let's keep this mystery train rolling. Friday evening arrived with a kind of oppressive humidity that made London feel like a hothouse, and Elara spent 3 excruciating hours preparing for what she had begun calling, in the privacy of her own mind, the opening salvo. Her lady's maid, Catherine, arranged her hair in an intricate cascade of curls woven with silver ribbon, and fastened her into a gown of sapphire silk that made her eyes look almost luminous. The effect was devastating, and Elara knew it. She needed every possible advantage for what was about to unfold. "You look absolutely breathtaking, my dear," Mrs. Pemberton said warmly as Elara descended the staircase of Davenport House. The elderly widow had served as Elara's chaperone since her debut 3 years ago, and despite her proper demeanor, she possessed an uncanny ability to sense when her charge was plotting something dangerous. "Lord Finch is a very fortunate gentleman." "It's merely a dinner party, Mrs. Pemberton," Elara replied, though her pulse hammered traitorously at her throat. Her father, the Earl of Davenport, glanced up from his correspondence in the drawing-room. "Finch. Westford's boy. Excellent family. Bit calculating from what I hear, but excellent bloodlines." "Papa," Elara protested weakly. "Just making observations, darling. Do try to enjoy yourself." The carriage ride to Finch Manor felt simultaneously endless and far too brief. Lord Alastair greeted them at the entrance with characteristic precision, his compliments so perfectly calibrated they felt rehearsed. Which, Elara suspected darkly, they probably were. "You honor my family with your presence, Lady Elara," he said, offering his arm with mathematical courtesy. The dinner party proved to be significantly larger than Alastair had described. At least 40 guests filled the candlelit drawing-room, their voices creating a pleasant hum of aristocratic conversation. Elara's stomach clenched when she spotted several familiar faces, including Viola, who caught her eye with an expression that clearly communicated, "I hope you survive whatever catastrophe you've engineered." But it was the tall, broad-shouldered figure near the fireplace that made Elara's breath catch and hold. Julian Beaumont stood in conversation with Lord Pemberton and another gentleman, a glass of wine suspended in his long fingers. He wore evening attire of devastating perfection. His black coat fitted so precisely it seemed molded to his frame, his cravat arranged in that complex style that somehow made him look both civilized and dangerous. He looked, Elara thought with a flash of genuine fury, absolutely magnificent. And he had no right to look that way while treating her with such calculated indifference. Then he turned, and his storm-gray eyes found hers across the room. The effect was instantaneous and electric. His gaze swept from her face downward to where her hand rested on Alastair's arm, and something dark and possessive flashed across his features. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and the wine glass in his hand froze halfway to his lips. 4-3 heartbeats. The entire room seemed to fade away until only that single burning connection remained. Alastair, blissfully oblivious to the sudden shift in atmospheric pressure, guided Elara further into the room, introducing her to various guests with elaborate courtesy. But Elara was hyper-aware of Julian's presence, of the way his attention kept returning to her even as he maintained polite conversation with Lord Pemberton, like a predator tracking prey while pretending disinterest. "Lady Elara," a voice said, low and controlled, and she turned to find Julian standing before her, having materialized with the silent grace of a hunting wolf. "How unexpected to see you here." "Your Grace," she replied, pleased when her voice emerged steady despite her racing heart. "I might say the same. I wasn't aware you were acquainted with the Finch family." "My connections are extensive," he said, his tone perfectly pleasant, but his eyes cold as winter steel. They flicked to Alastair, who had shifted almost imperceptibly closer to Elara in an unmistakably possessive gesture. "Though I confess I'm surprised to find you here as well." "Finch. Your Grace." Alastair interjected with a bow that was precisely as deep as protocol demanded, and not a fraction more. "How gracious of you to attend our modest gathering." Elara nearly laughed at calling Finch Manor, a sprawling estate in Mayfair, modest, but she maintained her composure. Julian's attention returned to her, and she felt pinned by the intensity of his gaze, like a butterfly mounted on velvet. "I wasn't aware that you and Lord Finch were acquainted," Julian continued, his voice deceptively casual. The pause before the word acquainted was deliberate, loaded with implication that made Elara's skin prickle. Beyond a passing introduction, that is. "We danced at the Thornbridge ball last week," Elara said lightly, though her fingers tightened on her fan. "Lord Finch was kind enough to extend this invitation. How thoughtful of him, don't you think?" The temperature in their immediate vicinity seemed to plummet. Alistair's smile had become somewhat fixed, though to his credit, he held his ground against the Duke's overwhelming presence. Julian took a single step closer, and Elara caught the scent of sandalwood and something darker, more complex. When he spoke again, his voice was soft, almost conversational, which somehow made it infinitely more dangerous. "Since when," he said, each word precisely enunciated, "have you had a suitor, Lady Elara?" The question hung in the air like a blade suspended above her throat. Elara's heart hammered so violently she was certain everyone in the room could hear it, but she forced herself to meet Julian's gaze with absolute steadiness. This was the moment. The precipice. Everything she'd planned, everything she'd risked, had led to this single exchange. Triumph and terror warred in her chest, but she lifted her chin and delivered the words she'd been rehearsing in her mind for days. "Since I decided I was tired of waiting for a gentleman who treats indifference as a virtue, Your Grace." The silence that followed was absolute and suffocating. Something terrible flickered in Julian's eyes. Not anger exactly, but something far more dangerous. Raw, undisguised jealousy, mixed with a possessive fury that transformed his entire face. His hand tightened around his wine glass so forcefully that Elara heard the crystal groan in protest. She half expected it to shatter, sending wine and blood across the pristine floor. But he didn't explode. Didn't create a scene. Didn't make a single dramatic gesture. Instead, Julian Beaumont simply looked at her with an intensity that felt like being flayed alive, his storm-gray eyes burning with something primal and terrifying that made her breath catch and her knees weaken. Then, with deliberate, controlled precision, he turned and walked away, his movements fluid and unhurried, as though nothing whatsoever had occurred. But Elara saw the rigid set of his shoulders, the white-knuckled grip on his wine glass, the way other guests instinctively moved aside as he passed, sensing danger they couldn't name. Viola materialized at her elbow moments later, her violet eyes wide with shock. "Elara," she whispered urgently, "what have you done?" Elara didn't answer. She couldn't. Because across the crowded drawing room, Julian had stopped near the fireplace and was staring at her with an expression that promised consequences. Not someday. Not eventually. Soon. Want to see more wild stories? Click subscribe and become part of the squad. The campaign began the very next morning, though Elara didn't recognize it as such until much later. She was browsing the exhibition at Christie's auction house with Alistair, examining a collection of rare French porcelain, when she felt the unmistakable weight of someone's gaze on the back of her neck. She turned, and there, across the crowded gallery, stood Julian Beaumont. He was ostensibly examining a maritime painting, but his storm-gray eyes were fixed on her with an intensity that made her breath catch. Their gazes locked for one suspended heartbeat, and then he looked away with deliberate casualness, as though her presence meant absolutely nothing to him. "That's an exquisite piece," Alistair was saying, gesturing to a delicate vase painted with pastoral scenes. "Sèvres porcelain, if I'm not mistaken. 18th century. I believe I shall bid on it." "It's lovely," Elara managed, though her attention remained fractured, hyper-aware of Julian's presence across the gallery. The auction began 20 minutes later. Alistair bid confidently on the Sèvres vase, his paddle rising with mathematical precision. The price climbed steadily, £50, 60, 75. The auctioneer was about to bring down his gavel when a deep, familiar voice cut through the room. £100. Elara's head snapped around. Julian stood near the back of the gallery, his paddle raised, his expression utterly neutral. Alistair's jaw tightened. 125. 175, Julian countered without hesitation. 200, Alistair said, his voice strained. Julian's eyes finally moved to Alistair, cold and assessing. 300 pounds. The room fell into shocked silence. 300 pounds for a decorative vase was absurd, bordering on mad. Alistair opened his mouth, then closed it again, his face flushed with frustrated defeat. Sold to His Grace, the Duke of Ashworth, the auctioneer declared, looking thoroughly bewildered by the unexpected windfall. Elara watched frozen, as Julian collected his utterly unnecessary purchase and walked past them without a single glance, the Sèvres vase tucked casually under his arm like a conquered trophy. "Well," Alistair said tightly, "that was certainly unexpected." It happened again 3 days later at the theatre. Elara and Alistair had settled into their box for a performance of Macbeth when she noticed Julian entering the box directly across from theirs. Not beside them. Not several boxes away. Directly opposite, where he would be in her line of sight for the entire performance. He didn't look at her once during the first act, but Elara couldn't concentrate on the play. She felt his presence like heat from a flame, constant and inescapable. During the interval, when Alistair excused himself to procure refreshments, Julian appeared in the doorway of her box with the silent inevitability of a storm cloud. "Lady Elara," he said, his voice perfectly cordial. "Enjoying the performance?" "Your Grace," she replied, her pulse hammering. "I didn't realize you were fond of Shakespeare." "There are many things you don't realize about me." The words were spoken mildly, but they landed like an accusation. "Though I confess I'm finding the audience far more interesting than the stage this evening." Before Elara could respond, Alistair returned with champagne, and Julian vanished as quickly as he'd appeared, leaving her shaken and confused. The pattern continued with relentless precision. At Lady Thornberry's garden party, Julian somehow ended up walking directly behind them on the narrow gravel path, forcing Alistair to step aside repeatedly. At the British Museum, he arrived mere minutes after them, his tall figure a constant presence in her peripheral vision. When they attended the Royal Academy exhibition, Julian was there, studying the paintings with apparent fascination, always exactly close enough to be impossible to ignore. Most disturbing was the incident on Curzon Street. Elara and Alistair were leaving a milliner's shop when their carriage attempted to exit the narrow lane, only to find it completely blocked by an enormous black carriage that had apparently suffered some sort of mechanical failure. The coachman apologized profusely, explaining that the wheel mechanism had seized unexpectedly and would require at least 30 minutes to repair. The crest on the carriage door belonged to the Duke of Ashworth. "This is becoming absurd," Viola whispered to Elara at Lady Pemberton's musicale the following evening. "He's everywhere you are. It's like being hunted." Elara didn't disagree, but something wild and reckless in her chest sang with triumph. Julian was rattled. The impenetrable Duke of Ashworth was actually, genuinely rattled. "Perhaps he's simply attending the same social functions we are," Elara said, though she didn't believe it for a moment. "Darling, he bid 300 pounds on a vase he doesn't want just to spite Lord Finch. This is not coincidence. This is war." That evening, exactly 2 weeks after the dinner at Finch Manor, Alistair invited Elara for a private walk in the gardens of her own home, with Mrs. Pemberton trailing at a respectful distance. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the manicured lawns, and the air smelled of roses and impending rain. "Lady Elara," Alistair began, his tone shifting to something more formal, more calculated. "I believe our acquaintance has progressed to a point where I might speak plainly." Elara's stomach clenched with sudden dread. "Of course, Lord Finch." You are a woman of exceptional breeding, intelligence, and beauty, he said, the words delivered like a business proposal. I am in a position to offer you a comfortable future, security, and a respected place in society. I have given this considerable thought, and I believe we would make an advantageous match. There was no passion in his voice, no warmth, no hint that he felt anything beyond strategic approval. I am asking you to consider becoming my wife, Lady Elara, Alistair continued. Not out of romantic sentiment, which I find terribly unreliable, but out of mutual respect and compatible circumstances. What do you say? Elara stood frozen, her mind reeling. This was what she'd wanted, wasn't it? To provoke Julian through visible courtship? Yet now, faced with the cold reality of Alistair's calculated proposal, she felt nothing but hollow despair. This wasn't love. This was a transaction, and she suddenly couldn't breathe under the weight of it. Lord Finch, she began, but her voice died in her throat as a tall figure emerged from behind the rose arbor. Julian stepped into the fading sunlight with the controlled fury of a barely caged predator, his storm-gray eyes blazing with something dark and possessive. He must have been there the entire time, concealed in the shadows, listening to every word. Lady Elara won't be accepting your offer, Finch, Julian said, his voice deadly quiet. Alistair stiffened. Your Grace, this is a private conversation. Was a private conversation, Julian corrected, his gaze never leaving Elara's face. Lady Elara, you're leaving with me. Now. It wasn't a request. It wasn't even a demand. It was a statement of absolute fact, delivered with such overwhelming authority that Elara felt it in her bones. Alistair stepped forward, his face flushed. You have no right. Julian's eyes finally cut to him, and whatever Alistair saw there made him step back instinctively, his protest dying unfinished. Elara, Julian said again, his voice dropping to something raw and almost desperate. Come with me. Please. And Elara, her heart pounding so hard she thought it might shatter her ribs, made her choice. She moved toward Julian, her hand trembling as she placed it in his outstretched palm. His fingers closed around hers with fierce possession, and without another word, he led her away from Alistair, away from safety, away from everything sensible, toward whatever catastrophic truth awaited them both. If you're loving the suspense, you know what to do. Hit that subscribe and let's get into it. Julian didn't speak as he led her through the gardens, his grip on her hand almost painfully tight, his stride so swift she nearly had to run to keep pace. They passed the fountain, the hedge maze, moving deeper into the grounds until they reached the glass conservatory at the far edge of the property. He yanked open the door and pulled her inside, the humid air hitting them like a physical wall. The conservatory was a jungle of exotic plants, palm fronds brushing against the curved glass ceiling, the air thick with moisture and the scent of orchids and rich earth. Twilight filtered through the glass panels, casting everything in shades of amber and shadow. The temperature was stifling, oppressive, making it difficult to breathe. Julian released her hand and turned away, his shoulders rigid, one hand raking through his dark hair in a gesture of barely controlled fury. For a long moment, he said nothing, just stood there with his back to her, breathing hard. Were you going to accept? His voice was low, dangerous. Were you actually going to marry that calculating bastard? Elara's own anger, suppressed for weeks, ignited. And what business is it of yours, Your Grace? You've made it abundantly clear that my future is of no concern to you. He whirled around, and the raw pain in his eyes nearly staggered her. No concern? You think I feel nothing. I think you've spent 2 years treating me like an inconvenient acquaintance. The words exploded from her, 2 years of frustrated longing pouring out. I think you've looked at me with the same warmth you'd show a piece of furniture. I think you've made it perfectly clear that I am nothing to you, Julian, so forgive me if I sought affection elsewhere." "Affection?" He laughed, the sound bitter and harsh. "Is that what you call Finch's bloodless proposal? A business arrangement masquerading as marriage?" "At least he offered." Elara shot back, her chest heaving. "At least he had the courage to speak plainly, to lay his intentions before me, instead of," her voice cracked, "instead of making me feel invisible." Something broke in Julian's expression. He took a step toward her, then another, until they were close enough that she could see the muscle ticking in his jaw, the wild desperation in his storm-gray eyes. "You think I haven't noticed you?" His voice dropped to something raw and jagged. "You think I haven't watched you walk into every ballroom for 2 years and felt the air leave my lungs? You think I don't know the exact shade of green your eyes turn when you're angry? That I haven't memorized every expression that crosses your face?" Elara's breath caught. "Then why?" "Because I'm drowning." The words ripped from him like a confession torn from his soul. "Because my father left the Ashworth estate in catastrophic debt, and I've spent the last 3 years desperately trying to save it from complete ruin. Because I wake every morning wondering if this will be the day I lose everything. The lands, the title, the legacy that's been in my family for 200 years. The words hung in the humid air between them, devastating in their honesty. "I have nothing to offer you, Elara," he continued, his voice breaking. "Nothing but a crumbling estate and a mountain of debt that grows larger every month no matter how viciously I economize. I've sold everything I can sell, dismissed half the staff, mortgaged properties, and still it's not enough. I'm one bad harvest away from losing it all." Tears burned in Elara's eyes. "You thought I cared about money? I thought you deserved better than a duke who can barely maintain his own household." Julian's hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You deserve security, comfort, a future without constant financial anxiety. You deserve everything I cannot give you." "You arrogant, impossible man," Elara whispered, moving closer until they were nearly touching. "Do you truly think so little of me? That I would choose security over love? That I would prefer a comfortable prison with a man I don't care for over a life with you, even if it meant we had to fight for every single thing?" "Elara." "I don't want comfort, Julian. I don't want careful distance or noble sacrifice. I want you. I want partnership, honesty, the chance to face whatever catastrophe comes next together instead of you carrying it alone like some martyr." His eyes searched her face with desperate intensity. "You don't understand what you're saying. The debt is something we can address together," she interrupted fiercely. "I have my own inheritance, Julian. My dowry isn't insignificant. And I have a mind that works perfectly well. If you trusted me enough to be honest, we could have been working on solutions instead of wasting 2 years in this miserable dance of avoidance." Something shifted in his expression, wonder mixing with lingering disbelief. "You would truly want this? Want me despite?" "I've wanted nothing else for 2 years, Elara said, her voice breaking on the words. "I've loved you since the first time you quoted Wordsworth at Lady Ashford's garden party and looked at me like I was the only person in the world who understood the reference. I've loved you through every agonizing moment of your careful indifference, every calculated distance, every time you walked away when all I wanted was for you to stay." "Elara." Her name left his lips like a prayer, and then his hands were in her hair, cradling her face with a tenderness that contrasted sharply with a fierce possession in his eyes. "I've been such a fool." "Yes," she agreed, her own hands coming up to grip his coat. "You have. I thought I was protecting you. You were torturing us both." "I love you," he said, the words raw and desperate. "God help me, I've loved you so long I can't remember what it felt like before. Every moment away from you has been agony, and watching you with Finch," his voice turned savage. "I wanted to destroy him. I wanted to challenge him to a duel just for daring to touch your hand." "Then stop talking," Elara whispered, "and kiss me." Julian's control shattered. He pulled her against him with fierce desperation, and his mouth claimed hers with 2 years of suppressed longing pouring into the kiss. It was nothing gentle, nothing careful. It was consuming and raw and perfect, his hands tangled in her hair, her fingers clutching his coat as though she could hold him in place through sheer force of will. The humid air pressed around them, the scent of orchids overwhelming, as they finally surrendered to everything they denied themselves. When they finally broke apart, both breathing hard, Julian rested his forehead against hers. "I'm still drowning in debt," he said quietly. "That hasn't changed." "Then we'll drown together," Elara replied, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "Or better yet, we'll find a way to swim. Together, Julian. No more secrets, no more noble distance. Promise me." His arms tightened around her. "I promise. God help you, Elara, I promise." Don't be a stranger. Subscribe now and let's dive deeper into the unknown. Julian didn't wait until morning. He didn't observe propriety or protocol or any of the careful social rules that governed their world. That very evening, he marched directly to the Earl of Davenport's study and requested Elara's hand in marriage with such fierce determination that her father later confessed he'd been slightly intimidated. "I love your daughter with everything I am," Julian had said, standing before the Earl's desk like a man prepared to go to war. "I have substantial debts to resolve, which I will not hide from you or from her. But I swear on my family's honor that I will spend every day of my life ensuring she never regrets choosing me." The Earl, who had watched his daughter pine for the Duke for 2 years, simply smiled and gave his blessing. The next morning, London society woke to find the Duke of Ashworth's engagement announcement in the Times, and by noon, the entire city was ablaze with gossip. But it was what happened at Lady Hartwell's ball that evening that truly set tongues wagging. Julian arrived with Elara on his arm, and the possessive pride in his bearing was unmistakable. He didn't hide his devotion behind careful courtesy or ducal restraint. When they entered the ballroom, his hand rested at the small of her back with clear ownership, and his eyes never left her face for more than a moment. Lord Alistair Finch approached them during the first hour, his expression carefully neutral. "Your Grace, Lady Elara, I wish to offer my congratulations." "Finch," Julian interrupted, his voice cordial but edged with steel. "I appreciate the sentiment, but let me be absolutely clear. Lady Elara is mine. She was always mine, even when I was too much of a fool to claim her properly. Any further interest you might have entertained ends tonight. I trust we understand each other." It wasn't a question. Alistair's jaw tightened, but he bowed with rigid correctness. "Perfectly, Your Grace." The ballroom had gone silent, everyone watching the exchange with barely concealed fascination. When Alistair retreated, Julian turned back to Elara with such open tenderness that several ladies actually sighed audibly. "Was that too much?" he asked quietly, though his eyes sparkled with unapologetic satisfaction. "It was perfect," Elara replied, fighting a smile. The real transformation, however, happened in the weeks that followed. Julian didn't just court Elara publicly, he made her a true partner in every sense. The morning after their engagement, he spread the estate's financial records across the library table at Ashworth House and walked her through every devastating detail. "These are the primary mortgages," he explained, pointing to a column of staggering figures. "And here are the outstanding loans. The Western properties are barely generating enough income to cover their maintenance costs, and the tenant farmers are struggling because the land hasn't been properly invested in for years," Elara finished, studying the documents with sharp attention. "Your father neglected infrastructure improvements." Julian looked at her with something close to reverence. Exactly. Then we consolidate, Elara said decisively. We sell the Western properties that are bleeding money and use the capital to improve the profitable estates. We renegotiate the mortgage terms with better rates. And we explore modern agricultural methods to increase yields. She glanced up at him. My dowry can cover the immediate debts, but we need a long-term strategy. You're extraordinary, Julian said, his voice rough with emotion. I'm practical, Elara corrected. And I'm yours. Which means your problems are my problems, and we solve them together. They spent the next 6 weeks working side by side, restructuring the Ashworth finances with methodical precision. Elara discovered she had a natural talent for estate management, and Julian discovered that having a partner who challenged his assumptions made him a better duke. By the time their wedding approached, they'd already reduced the debt by 1/3 and established a clear path to solvency. The wedding itself was held at St. George's in Hanover Square on a brilliant autumn morning. Elara walked down the aisle in a gown of ivory silk, her heart so full she thought it might burst. But it was when she reached the altar and saw Julian's face, the raw love and fierce pride in his storm-gray eyes, that she knew with absolute certainty she'd made the right choice. "I love you," he whispered as they exchanged vows, his hands trembling slightly as they held hers. "Every difficult, stubborn, brilliant part of you." "I love you too," she whispered back. "Every complicated, impossible part of you." When Julian kissed her, sealing their union, the church erupted in applause, but Elara barely heard it. She was too focused on the man before her, the future they would build together, the partnership that would define the rest of their lives. The years that followed proved even better than Elara had dared imagine. They worked tirelessly to restore the Ashworth estate, and within 18 months, they'd not only eliminated the debt but had begun turning a profit. Julian involved Elara in every major decision, valuing her insight and intelligence, and their partnership became legendary in their social circle. 2 years after their wedding, on a warm spring morning, Elara sat in the newly renovated conservatory at Ashworth House, their infant daughter sleeping peacefully in her arms. The same conservatory where Julian had finally confessed his love now served as her favorite refuge, the glass walls allowing sunlight to pour over the thriving plants. Julian entered quietly, settling beside her on the cushioned bench and gazing down at their daughter with such tender awe it made Elara's throat tighten. "She has your eyes," he murmured, his finger gently stroking the baby's tiny hand. "She has your stubborn chin," Elara countered, smiling. Julian laughed softly, then wrapped his arm around Elara's shoulders, pulling her against him. "Do you remember the night I dragged you in here like a madman?" "You mean the night you finally stopped being an idiot?" Elara teased. "That very night," he agreed, pressing a kiss to her temple. "I was so terrified of losing everything that I nearly lost the only thing that actually mattered." "But you didn't," Elara said softly, leaning into his warmth. "We found each other. We saved each other." "We did," Julian murmured, his voice thick with emotion. "And I wake up every morning grateful that you were brave enough to make me face my fears. That you refused to let me hide behind noble excuses." Their daughter stirred slightly, making a small sound of contentment before settling back into sleep. Outside the conservatory windows, the Ashworth estate grounds stretched in every direction, prosperous and thriving, a testament to what could be achieved through partnership and fearless honesty. "I love you," Julian said quietly, the same words he'd spoken 2 years ago in this very room, but now weighted with a depth of shared triumph and hard-won joy. "I love you too," Elara replied, tilting her face up for his kiss. "Always." And in that moment, with their daughter sleeping peacefully between them and their future stretching bright and limitless ahead, Elara knew with absolute certainty that every risk, every moment of uncertainty, every bold choice had been worth it. They hadn't just found love. They'd built something fearless, something enduring, something that would last a lifetime. Want to see more wild stories? Click subscribe and become part of the squad.